Hi there, and welcome to The Wrap, simple news updates for busy people, brought to you by Verashni Pillay, myself, Sarah Evans, and the Explain.coza team. This week, we take a look at why South African Airways is SA's drunk uncle. In the big story, we explain the midterm budget. In our news briefs, President Cyril Ramaphosa is in quarantine, and we get some relief from tired African stereotypes. Looking ahead, the US and the DA are set to elect new leaders. Or will it be the same old suspects? Now, every family has a drunk uncle, right? You know, the one who gets wasted at every family gathering and tells embarrassing stories that literally no one needs to hear. Well, SA's drunk uncle at the moment is South African Airways. And most people agree that it needs to take its drunken self home and sleep it off before heading straight for the nearest rehab. Everyone, it seems, besides our Finance Minister Tito Mbowene's financially challenged cabinet colleagues. Wednesday's midterm budget speech showed that Mboweni clearly lost the battle to shut down this giant drain on the public's purse. As financial journalist Ray Matlaka bluntly put it on Twitter, the budget announced by Mboweni on Wednesday simply raided government department budgets and cut social programs to free up funds for SAA and its business rescue process. Now, we get it. The drunk uncle was so crap at managing his finances that the rest of the family have had to pay his debts. But that means there's less for other relatives who are frankly more deserving. That includes crucial areas like police, local government, and student funding. We're literally raiding the saving account for the kids' education to prop up our drunken uncle. And so SAA will get 10.5 billion rand to pay off its debt. This is on top of the 16.4 billion rand allocated in the main budget in 2020 to settle historic debt. Now remember, this is not defined as a bailout, as it's not continuous funding. As part of the airline's torturous business rescue process, it needs a cash injection to settle outstanding obligations, which Mboweni points out the government has to honor, but it still sucks. While some may be celebrating the cuts to public servant wages, the expenditure cuts in government will hurt our country in three significant ways. Through less money for education, by reducing service delivery at local government level, and by freezing money we pay to our public servants, and that includes healthcare workers during a pandemic, no less. As economist Jeff Schultz says, this is probably the easiest state-owned enterprise to cut loose, and yet the cabinet fought tooth and nail to force the National Treasury to fund it. Now, government keeps talking about finding a strategic private partner to take over the airline, but we haven't heard of any success with that yet. I mean, who would want to? Meanwhile, we're dealing with a once-in-a-generation global economic crisis, and what we don't need is a short-sighted obsession with one state-owned company. It's better to rip off the Band-Aid now and take the business rescue option that will wind up the airline. This will prevent any risk to us as taxpayers having to pay its debts again in the future. Now, we're going to break down the budget for you. So what was all that ruckus about a budget this week? Honestly, wrapping your head around big numbers and economic terminology on top of everything else that's going on is a lot. So we did a bit of digging to bring you a special budget edition of The Wrap and everything you need to know about the medium-term budget policy statement that Finance Minister Tito Mboweni presented in Parliament yesterday. Let's start with the good news. Yes, SA is in dire financial straits, but the economy is going to get slightly better in the near future. Mboweni estimates that it will recover in the next 3 months and that economic growth will be at 3.3% early next year. Thereafter, it will decline slightly for the next 3 years. This comes as National Treasury predicts that the economy will shrink by 7.8% this year, thanks to COVID-19. So any recovery, small as it may be, is not to be sniffed at. The expected recovery is part of a global trend, Mboweni said, and developing countries like South Africa are set to rebound faster than developed countries like the United States. So what are the National Treasury's priority areas? All things social, it seems. Nearly half of the 6.2 trillion rand that the government is spending is going to developmental items. So that's over R1 trillion to education and culture, over almost another R1 trillion to social development, and over 700 billion rand to health. Now, more than just relying on international trends, South Africa's financial recovery depends on a huge infrastructure drive that the government is undertaking. In other words, the government plans to build its way out of the economic hole that we're in. On Wednesday, Mboweni said an infrastructure fund set up to do this has some ambitious projects lined up. The fund and its staff are situated in the presidency, and those managing it are experienced technical people from both the public and private sector, he said. Over the next 10 years, the government plans to spend more than 20 billion rand on subsidies for a social housing scheme to benefit poor and working class people. The fund is also supposed to go towards a huge student housing scheme, which aims to provide accommodation for 300,000 students every year once it is complete. To put a spin on an age-old saying, 3 things are sure in life: death, Mboweni's terrible cooking, and taxes. You just can't escape any of them. Although there's probably more chance of us cheating death than Mboweni taking up a hobby which doesn't involve compromising a nation's gag reflexes. We suggest you take up gardening, Tito. Unfortunately, it looks like taxes will go up in the next 3 years. We'll only know more when the big budget is presented in February 2021. And Times Live reports that government wants to raise an additional 5 billion rand in taxes over the next year and 40 billion rand over the next 4 years. It looks like Mboweni won't be the only person stocking up on cans of pilchards from now on. And what about social grants? Well, we know that millions of people avoided starvation during the lockdown. The so-called hard lockdown, when most economic activity shut down, took place from March until May. And this was thanks to a special COVID-19 grant. We know about this thanks to the NIDS CRAM survey conducted by a team of academics on the effect of the grants on SA's poorest. Government gave these to people who'd lost their income and had no other grants coming in. Mboweni said on Wednesday that 22 million people, that's nearly half the population, received some kind of cash grant during the lockdown. The special COVID grant reached 6 million people, he said. The grant has been extended to the end of January 2021, and the government has set aside R1 billion for food relief. But what about Eskom? Did we mention that not only does SA have a drunk uncle, it also has a problem child? And its name is Eskom, and it has a gaping 490 billion rand debt problem that just keeps growing. With SA's finances being squeezed, all eyes were on Mboweni on Wednesday to see if the government had come up with any solutions to Eskom's financial problems yet. We'll have to wait and see, was his answer. He said that government's plans for Eskom would be announced soon, although no timelines were given. Let's hope he doesn't lose that fight in cabinet too. On the plus side, Eskom is going to start letting municipalities buy electricity from private providers, which will hopefully mean less load shedding and cheaper electricity. This is long overdue. In our news briefs this week. Now, President Cyril Ramaphosa is in self-imposed quarantine after a dinner guest hosted by the president on Saturday tested positive for COVID-19. Rumors doing the rounds on social media that the country will return to level 3 lockdown are, quote, simply not true, according to the president. According to News 24, the president said this week that while the government was seeing some, quote, concerns around COVID-19 infections, there was no cause for alarm. On to Miss SA. Now, Shuduvatso Musida was crowned the new Miss South Africa last weekend. The 29-year-old international relations student comes from Limpopo and told radio stations Cape Talk and 702 that she plans to use her reign to highlight mental health issues. Why should you care? The pageant has been getting kudos of late for becoming more inclusive of South Africa's diverse women. Better late than never. Musida won praise for embracing her baldness. An article by Global Citizen reports that although the pageant began in 1953, the first black African Miss SA, Jackie Mofokeng, was only crowned 40 years later in 1993. Since then, only a handful of African black women have won the crown. Their analysis, while leaving out the fact that so many so-called colored women may also identify as black, makes an important point. Last year's winner and reigning Miss Universe, Zozobini Tunzi, broke the mold of traditional pageant ideals with her dark skin and short hair and brought renewed interest to the competition. Now, the 6-year-old case of the murder mystery of Senzo Miwa is back in the headlines after police found new evidence about the former Bafana Bafana captain's murder. The National Prosecuting Authority raised eyebrows this week when it accidentally released a document to the media showing that the police are investigating whether his girlfriend and singer, Kelly Khumalo, communicated with the alleged killers. Given the heated feelings around the case, this is a dangerous mistake. The document was later withdrawn by the NPA and Khumalo has not been charged. There have been too many instances in which the NPA has bungled or been seen to mishandle important high-profile matters, and that should scare all of us, since it raises the question of what's happening with smaller cases that might involve ordinary Joes like us. We are avid supporters of a strong prosecutorial force, step up NPA, and rein in those potentially very dangerous mistakes. Now, could we be looking at President Zuma 2.0? God help us. Former President Jacob Zuma's son, Duduzane, says he might run for president. The former Gupta business partner told Newsroom Africa on Thursday that he was considering a move to politics and that we might see his face on a ballot paper in 2024. The younger Zuma has been living in Dubai for several years and said this was because he had been, quote, financially excluded from doing business in South Africa. Honestly, we're devastated for him. Now, would you take a gun to a knife fight with a mentally ill person? When will it end? Police brutality in the United States has again taken center stage just days before the country's elections, with the death this week of 27-year-old black man Walter Wallace Jr. in Philadelphia. Heartbreakingly, he was killed after police responded to a 911 call from his family, who were actually asking for an ambulance because Wallace, who'd been diagnosed with bipolar disorder, seemed to be having a breakdown. He was holding a knife and slowly approached police officers who fired at him 14 times. Protests have erupted across the city. Meanwhile, non-profit news outlet The Marshall Project reported this week that according to a survey of over 2,000 prisoners in the US, the number one thing respondents said would have kept them out of jail was mental health counseling and affordable housing. Speaking of mental health, it's still Mental Health Awareness Month, so head over to explain.coza to read about what not to say to someone with mental illness and how to care for a suicidal loved one. Now, a controversial trailer for a new documentary series about Oscar Pistorius has been removed by the BBC after backlash on social media for not acknowledging the victim at all. The trailer did not feature Reeva Steenkamp, nor did it use her name, and the BBC subsequently issued a statement apologizing for the trailer, saying it regretted that Reeva's name was not used and adding that the rest of the series examines in detail a number of complex issues connected to her murder. Still, despite his murder conviction, Oscar is held up as some sort of fallen hero, and his victim, a victim of the sort of intimate partner violence that leaves thousands of women dead each year, is erased. Atrocious. So UK mega fundraising organisation Comic Relief will stop its practice of creating poverty porn videos for donations. Their fundraising efforts usually feature white celebrities like Ed Sheeran and desperately poor Africans. After years of criticism leveled at this sort of fundraising, Comic Relief finally got the memo. While raising money is important and appreciated, playing into the white savior complex is not. As one critic noted, there are other emotions to draw on to raise money apart from guilt and pity. Hope, for example, is more powerful. Those behind the criticism were mostly within Europe and the UK itself. We're glad we have one less battle to fight as Africans. In our accountability monitor this week, former State Security Minister and ANC MP Bongani Bongo was arrested this week for corruption. Bongo and 10 others appeared in court this week on charges related to government land deals in Mpumalanga for housing. The problem was that the land wasn't suitable for housing, and it's alleged that the accused then wove an intricate web to pocket some of the money. Bongo is obviously protesting his innocence and pledging to clear his name. We, on the other hand, are getting the popcorn out and waiting for the next installment of Those Who Thought They'd Get Away With It. It's our new favorite series. Watch with us. Check out our accountability monitor at explain.coza, where we keep track of the latest in the fight against corruption. Now looking ahead. The US is set to vote for its next president and vice president on Tuesday. Incumbent Donald Trump is facing off against Democratic contender and former Vice President Joe Biden. Business Insider is reporting that the election may shatter all previous voter turnout numbers, as over 50% of all voters in the 2016 election have already cast early votes. So far, Biden is the front runner as far as the polls are concerned, but anything could happen on election day. Both hopefuls have been urging voters to head out to the polls next week, although Trump, never one to miss an opportunity to completely miss the moment, complained on Twitter this week that Biden was not trending on the platform. If that is what's bothering the Donald the most at this point, we'd hate to see what he will have to say when Biden trends number one amongst voters in the election. Time will tell. Meanwhile, people are genuinely concerned about unrest after the election and possible violence. Let's hope that's not the case. Maybe the US could learn from South Africa and other nations on the continent that quietly pull off free, fair elections every few years. Back to local political news. By the time you read the wrap next week, the DA could have a new leader in KwaZulu-Natal, Mbali Ntuli. The problem is, it probably won't. The party heads to selective conference this weekend to vote for new leadership, and it's pretty much expected that the incumbent acting leader John Steenhuisen will be elected as its leader. Nevertheless, the showdown is expected to be nothing less than historic for the party, which stands to lose considerable black votership if it is seen to be sidelining another competent and talented black leader like Ntuli. And that's it from us at The Wrap, a product of Explain.coza, simple news summaries for busy people. Remember to share the love. Tell your friends to sign up for updates at www.explain.coza/subscribe. Till next time, goodbye from Verashni, myself, Sarah, and Tash.